All right, this begins our study of World War II. This is chapter 16, World War Looms. And so, as we talked about, we're going to be focusing just on the United States and its lead up into World War II. The project we did with the My Maps uh, did a lot of stuff that we covered already in world history. So, that's what we're getting here in lecture number one. So, what we talked about before and you probably are aware of is that nationalism is growing a lot through Europe and Asia, and that's really going to have a major impact on what leads into World War II, particularly out of World War One. We talked previously about the failures of the World War One peace settlement, and these are numerous. So just to go through some of them, just to kind of restart and rejog your memory here, is that one, it caused a lot of anger and resentment in many different countries. Italy was upset because they didn't get all the stuff they felt they deserved for switching sides during the war. Japan didn't get what they felt like they deserved in terms of all the stuff they helped out with the Allies in the Pacific. Uh, Germany's upset. The Soviet Union's upset. A lot of people are angry. Germany itself rallies really hard. Once the treaty is signed, it's not fair. Uh, Clause 231 of the Treaty of Versailles blamed them for starting the war, which again can be it's a very wishy-washy situation there, but they're the ones when the ink is dried blamed for it, which they're not happy about. They're stripped a lot of their overseas possessions and a lot of their border territories. A major thing that Hitler is really angry about and really brings up again and again and again about the Treaty of Versailles is his hated Polish corridor in order to help the newly created country of Poland be able to do more international trade. A thin little corridor of land was given to the new country that split East Prussia away from the new post-World War One Germany, and the free city of Danzig was contained within this Polish corridor as a port, as an outlet into the Baltic, and people are pretty upset about that, particularly Hitler. So that's why Germany says the treaty is fair. The Soviet Union is extraordinarily angry about losing territory from Russia. They weren't consulted about creating a lot of these new, particularly Baltic countries, Poland, and some other places, so they're unhappy that they lost territory. President Woodrow Wilson, as we previously discussed, said that one of his main goals was setting up democratic governments in Europe. These governments are set up in Europe, but they fail shortly after the war. And you can make the argument that there's really no democratic tradition in Europe at this point. There's a few outlying cases, but people dating back to the Romans, you can think of like Charlemagne or Frederick II or others, have always looked to strong leaders to solve their problems, and that's, as you probably are aware of, what they're going to do following World War One. So, to give you just an idea geographically, this is what Europe looks like following the Treaty of Versailles and setting it up from there. As we discussed, Germany has to give up this sliver of land, right, that sets off East Prussia away from the rest of Germany, which people like Hitler are going to be particularly upset about. What is the United States doing? The United States is going to cling very steadily and very wholeheartedly to the policy of isolationism. The idea that they are going to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, that they are going to let the rest of the world do whatever they want to do, and they're going to go from there. Now, that makes a lot of sense, particularly when you get into the 1930s, as the US economy begins to bottom out during the Great Depression. It makes sense for them there. Now, some people in the United States believe that the only reason the United States entered into World War One was so that greedy bankers and fat cat industrialists could get rich off of war profits. And they don't want to send boys from Kansas or Nebraska or Hoboken, New Jersey, off to go fight in these other European interventions just for the sole purpose of enriching bankers and industrialists. So while you can argue that that is 100% not the actual factual state for why the United States entered into World War One, sometimes we discuss in history it's what the beliefs of people are, what public opinion is, rather than what is. And so as we move to the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s, the Americans as a people themselves are more determined than ever to avoid war. We begin having a lot of opposition to foreign intervention and foreign policy decisions by a lot of senators in the United States Senate, which act as a counterpoint to a worldly president like a Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So what is Roosevelt doing once he's elected in terms of his foreign policy? We spent two chapters talking about what he does domestically. Well, the first thing that he does in 1933 is recognize diplomatically the Soviet Union. So what does this mean? Is that United States recognizes that this country exists. And as we've discussed previously, United States and communism don't get along very well. So this is a major step forward for this. Remember, the United States sent Marines into Vladivostok, into Archangel, to be able to help out the white armies in the Russian Civil War following the breakdown of the Russian Revolution in World War One. And Stalin, in particular, is going to remember that for a very long time, that the United States tried to keep the Soviet Union from coming from there. So that's a major deal from there. Roosevelt also continues President Herbert Hoover's good neighbor policy in Latin America. This is the idea the United States is going to be a good neighbor to the countries in the Caribbean and south of the Rio Grande. And what this means is that basically the United States is no longer going to do like it's been doing since Teddy Roosevelt of um, having armed interventions in these Caribbean, South American, and Latin American countries. In 1934, the final troops leave from Haiti after being there for nearly 30 years from Port-au-Prince, and Roosevelt has um, representatives go to the Montevideo Conference in 1934 and be able to promise the Latin American countries unequivocally that the Roosevelt administration will not use armed forces in the domestic arenas of other countries. And that really goes a lot of ways from this. This good neighbor policy is tested in the late 1930s when Mexico nationalizes its oil companies, and a lot of people in the United States pressure Roosevelt to go into Mexico with the army to steal that stuff back for them. But Roosevelt does a very good job of working through there. He signs a reciprocal trade agreement with Latin American countries and moves it on from there. As we begin to move through the 1930s, as the bellicosity and war begins to, war sabers begin to rattle in Europe, in 1935, the Senate passes the Neutrality Acts. And what this did was it outlawed arms sales or loans to nations in 1935 at war or nations in a civil war. So if you know your history, you've talked about this by 1935, this is targeting two nations in particular. Italy in its invasion into Ethiopia, and also the Spanish Civil War that's begun to rage very quickly from there. And so this is trying to keep the United States from being drawn into those foreign entanglements. So we have a couple different cartoons we just want to work our way through here. Again, we have Uncle Sam right here saying, anytime I think of getting another war or financing another one, just take a look at that. And again, you have this painting here of a big European banker going, giving all this money from there. Now, again, this is playing on a lot of anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish people being involved in the banking system, and so that's kind of it's a little anti-Semitism going along with this cartoon as well. But that's what he's doing. In this one, you have Roosevelt, all right, signing the U.S. Neutrality Acts, and here you have the ghost of Woodrow Wilson, right, saying, "I hope you had a better luck than I did." Remember, in 1916, Roosevelt ran on a campaign in the midst of World War One that a vote for Wilson will be a vote for American neutrality, and then in just 6 months later, in April of 1917, Wilson's declaring war in World War One. So that's that's going there. Uh, Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, is a famous cartoonist at this point before he's the Dr. Seuss you're probably familiar with, and he does a lot of different cartoons on this area as well. We have Uncle Sam sleeping soundly because Europe has got Stalinitis and Hitleritis and Blitzpox and Nazi fever, fascist fever, Italian mumps, and so Rose uh, Roosevelt and his neutrality is going to keep Uncle Sam without a chance of contagion from there. Here, the United States is sitting high and pretty because they're isolated, right, as well from Hitler going and trying to chop down all those other trees in Europe. And then again, in other ways, you can kind of see some of his political leanings there is that Dr. Seuss is saying, hey, this aid will help win the war, but the neutrality acts are kind of going, helping keep it back from there. So it's a double-edged sword from there. And again, this good neighbor policy is what the United States begins to promise Latin American countries that they're going to be good neighbors, that they're going to not start to intervene like a Wilson, particularly, and a Theodore Roosevelt did in these Latin American countries. So neutrality is going to begin to break down, begins to break down in Asia. Japan looking to go and further carve out more territory for itself to kick out the Europeans and create an Asia for the Asians, launches large-scale attacks on China in 1937. It's invading most of the major cities along the coastline, and famously they bomb Shanghai in July of that year, with Shanghai being a very international, being a very British city. That causes a lot of worldwide outcry at this and begins to put America kind of in this tough spot. Now, Roosevelt wants to find ways to send aid to China, um, but he has to work around the Neutrality Acts. And remember that Roosevelt and the United States have been buddies with China since before the United States ever existed. So he wants to do that. And he's able to do that because Japan never officially declares war against China. And so, because they never signed an official declaration of war, technically, in no sense of the words, China and Japan aren't at war. And so the Neutrality Acts then don't move from there. And so he's able to continue to send arms and supplies into China, including the famous American Flying Tiger fighter pilots who are flying their P-40 warplanes all right from there. And so Roosevelt also at this time calls on peace-loving nations to quarantine aggressor nations to help stop the spread of war. But this again just becomes rhetoric and words in the face of actual outright aggression. Again, we want to try to answer this question, try to figure out when does the United States actually enter into World War II? And obviously the answer is December 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But here, right, by the end of the 1930s, you have American pilots flying American planes, shooting American bullets over the skies of China against the Japanese. Is the United States at war? And that's a question we're going to try to have to figure out for yourself. So this is what Japan begins to do here. It's already started claiming a whole lot of other territories. It begins to work out right from there. Again, the capture of Shanghai is a pretty a famous event. So it goes there marching on the Great Wall of China, working right through there. This is a very famous photo of a the train station in Shanghai with the little baby. And again, we can use this as an example of photography in kind of understanding history. The boy's father is just off the screen there, just out of frame. But again, it makes much more poignant and evocative picture if the baby is just there wailing and crying, right, all bloody and bruised up, right in the middle there. So more pictures again as Japanese are going from there, and then the Americans are sent over there to this. The Flying Tigers famously have the shark's teeth design painted on the nose of their airplanes, and we showed you the picture. The Walt Disney Company actually comes up with the logo that they use while they're flying around. So as we move right into the end of the 1930s, the United States is going to move with very cautious steps away from this neutrality policy. December of 1939, Hitler goes and invades Poland. 2 days later, France and Great Britain declare war on Nazi Germany. The United States says that they will pass the cash and carry provision, where the United States will only sell arms to any warring nations as long as they pay cash and they transport their arms in their own ships. They don't want to put American boys in harm's way. So if you're willing to sail across the Atlantic, show up with briefcases full of cash, the Americans will load up American guns, take the money, and put it on your own ships, and you can risk away. Roosevelt's doing this to help Great Britain and France, and also as the kind of straight up principle that it's going to help keep the United States out of the war. This changes pretty rapidly with the changing situation, particularly in the summer of 1940, as the tides begin to turn against the British. In the summer of 1940, Great Britain really becomes the last bastion of kind of freedom of standing up to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany in Europe. You can read the Lucas's book, The 5 Days in May, where right around the time of Dunkirk, as the Nazis are surrounding the British army that's left there as the French are surrendering. The British government is negotiating within itself, is trying to figure out whether they're going to surrender to the Nazis or not. And it's a very close run thing. It's three guys in the British government don't, who want to surrender the Nazis, cut them off, keep them out of Britain, and it's Winston Churchill and a general or two who are saying no, we got to keep fighting from there. Ro Churchill is begging and borrowing as much as he can from Roosevelt, and the famous destroyers for bases deal is able to be given from Roosevelt, where Roosevelt promises Britain all aid short of war and trades guns and 50 old obsolete destroyers for British bases in the Western Hemisphere. As the Italians are knocked out of the war in September of 1940, September 27th, Japan, Germany, and Italy sit down and sign the Tripartite Pact, naming themselves an Axis powers, the axis of steel that's going to bind them together. The sole reason that these three countries, particularly why Japan and Germany are signing this treaty, is to put a target right in the middle of the United States of America. The aim is to keep the U.S. out of the war. The United States declares a war in Japan and the Pacific, then Germany will force the United States to fight a war in the Atlantic and vice versa. And the idea behind it is to try to force the United States to fight a two-ocean war. And everybody knows that it's impossible. There's no way a country can fight in the European theater of operations across the Atlantic Ocean while simultaneously also fighting in the Pacific Ocean, right, across from there. It's impossible, and that's what Hitler and the Japanese are trying to force the United States, right, into an impossible situation. So that's their goal. So as we begin to move against some more cartoons for you, Europe's troubles, Roosevelt's trying to get caught in, and here's the Senate, here's Uncle Sam trying to pull him back, saying, hey, we want more reasonable neutrality. We don't want to get caught up from this. One of the small steps that he makes is the bases, destroyers for bases deal, and whereas the United States gets some of these bases from the British in return for some old destroyers to help the British out, particularly with their convoy system, be able to pick the stuff up in the cash and carry provision in the Atlantic. So on September 27th, 1940, there's Representative Japanese, Mussolini, and Hitler, Italy, Germany, Hitler, let's start again. Germany, Mussolini, and Italy, and Japan all signing the Tripartite Pact, right, to become the Axis powers. France falls in the summer of 1940, right? By July, it's gone and it's knocked out of the war. And it's this event that is the big kind of final domino that really wakes the United States up to this is going to be a different conflict than what they were anticipating to. And this jolts the United States out of isolation. It does two things. So the fall of France has two major effects in the United States. One, Congress agrees to boost defense spending. And so for the real first time, a preparedness is what it's called campaign begins to where the United States says, well, let's start building up our gun supplies, our tank supplies, our airplanes in order to be prepared in case something happens. The other thing that it does is that out of this preparedness, they said, well, we need a army to be able to use all this stuff. And so the Selective Training and Service Act is passed in the summer of 1940. And what this is this marks America's first peacetime military draft. This law requires 16 million men in the United States who are between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for the draft. Now, that's all they're doing. They're registering. They're not in the army yet. Once they've registered, the government that goes in and picks their names out of paper, and over 1 million of them will be drafted for just 1 year terms. So by the end of 1941, if nothing happens in the United States, hypothetically, as it's spelled out in the law, these men would just go back home. Again, isolationists in Congress are able to tack on, right, the idea that these men are only, however, going to be allowed to serve in the Western Hemisphere. So really what it's forcing is that America is going to defend its borders, but it's still not willing to go and take that step out into the international stage with its troops in foreign military intervention. While all this is happening here in 1940, it is a presidential election year. And Roosevelt has to make a very kind of important political move because he's got 2 year term and George Washington's traditions of 2 year terms is kind of up. And Roosevelt decides he's going to run for a third term. There's nothing legally stopping him from doing that. And he's going to, in these uncertain times and still really not the best economy, is going to try to go and fix things to try to help his New Deal stay in place. He breaks with Washington's tradition. The Republicans run Wendell Willkie, right, against him, and essentially, I for our purposes, they have very similar policies, and because Wilkie never really breaks away with anything drastically different from Roosevelt, because they're the same and they're alike on many issues, people are just going to go with the known quality of Roosevelt, and he goes and wins out and wins his third of eventually 4 terms as president. So to finish up, here's Roosevelt signing the Selective Service and Training Act, and then we have the first draft of the lottery system of people's names being drawn and be drafted into the Army. Once they're drafted into the Army, they're then sent to camps all around the United States, right, where again they are taught how to be a good soldier, where they're moved into that, where they're training in calisthenics and physical fitness, training these soldiers how to fight and do that. And again, while all this is happening, Wendell Willkie is running his Republican campaign for president, and he's the nominee who will lose out to Roosevelt as he begins his third um, term as president in very uncertain times for the United States and its future. And that's what we'll get into in the next lecture.